Hey, what's up? It's me, Lex, back at you with another Pathfinder video. Today I'm just doing a quick read-through and overview of the Runesmith in Pathfinder 2nd edition. This is one of the other, the second new class in the Impossible playtest. Runesmith is an intelligence key attribute martial class, and the way it functions, essentially, is that you utilize runes to both pre-buff yourself and your team, and to inflict opponents or your allies with certain magical effects in the middle of combat. Its action economy is kind of loose, but also pretty tight. You have the ability to do things at range for more actions or up close for less, which means if you kind of have the right positioning, you can save a lot of actions. But before I get too off into different exceptions, let's go over the class itself. So it's an intelligence key attribute class with 8 hit points, so it's going to be about as tanky as a thaumaturge, so closer to the glass cannon end, or not necessarily cannon, but the glassy end of martials, but still with some solid enough staying power, particularly if you have a healer. Their initial proficiencies are trained in perception, expert in fortitude and will, and only trained in reflex. They are trained in crafting, 1 of the 4 magic skills, and 2 additional skills plus your intelligence modifier, which should be 4 since it's your key attributes, which is quite a few skills. Their attacks are simple and martial weapons, as well as obviously unarmed attacks. And then they have light and medium armor and unarmored defense, but no heavy armor. As well as that, they are trained in their class DC. This is the tool that they're going to use for many of their abilities. So, they're landing very solidly into the kind of middle of the road, some of the squishier ends of the martial spectrum, but still not into properly squishy. There's no restriction to light armor or anything like that, and their saves starting off are about average. Now, when we get into the Runesmith's class abilities, we have a few key terms. Runes are how their magical effects are used. They can be applied via etching, which is when you spend time in exploration mode to permanently place a rune on something, or tracing, which is when you use actions in encounter mode to put a rune onto something for a round. Invocation is the way to invoke the effects, more potent effects of various runes. So every rune has a passive effect and an invoked effect, and when you invoke it, you can invoke any number of runes within a certain area of yourself. Then it will have its invocation effect and then disappear and no longer provide the passive effect. And then finally, there is diacritic. This is a fancy keyword or a trait that means it is a rune that is applied onto another rune. So you can modify the effects of something that you have already put onto another thing. This will kind of clear up once we get into the runes themselves. Now, so the class goes over, of course, the normal benefits that every character gains, and then it goes over how runes function. Runes can be etched or traced, and you have a number of runes that you can sustain etched at any time. Etching runes requires an artisan's toolkit, so you're going to need a hand free and some tools worn or held. By default, you can sustain up to 2 etched runes at a single time, and you can etch any number of runes up to this maximum during daily prep and when you spend 10 minutes in exploration mode. As you increase in level, the amount of etched runes you can have at a given time increases, and if we scroll down here, you can see it increases all the way to 6 maximum, from 2 to 6. Etched runes remain indefinitely until they're either expended or removed, and if you etch more runes than your maximum, the oldest rune fades. And then the trace runes are drawn lightly in dust, light, or a similar fleeting medium. The Trace Rune action, which is how you get those traced runes, is 1 action or 2 actions. It has the Manipulate trait. It's magical, it's concentrate. It requires that you have a hand free or are holding an artisan's toolkit. So the hand situation for a runesmith, if you're going to be taking advantage of your trace rune, will be a little bit tight. Your fingers dance. You apply 1 rune onto an adjacent target matching the rune's usage description. So some runes can be applied onto creatures, some can be applied onto objects. That's how you do that there. The rune remains until the end of your next turn, and if you spend 2 actions, you can draw it to cause it to appear on a target within 30 feet. There is no limit to how many runes you can have out at once. The only limit is how many you can have etched during exploration mode. And then as for how you invoke the runes and gain their invoked effect, there's the Invoke Rune action, a single action with the magical and invocation traits. Interestingly enough, not the auditory trait, so if you're in a completely silenced area, this theoretically would still work. You utter the name of 1 or more of your runes within 30 feet, and the runes blaze with power. It applies the effect in its invocation entry, and then the rune fades away. You can invoke any number of runes with a single Invoke Rune action, but creatures that would be affected by multiple copies of the same specific rune are affected only once. And diacritics, because they are applied onto a rune rather than modifying or replacing it, do not cause a rune to become a new one. So if you want to use the Fire Rune, for example, it will only apply once, no matter how many times or different ways you have it on a creature. As for runic magic, runes are magical effects. Some of them have specific tradition traits out of the 4 traditions, and any runes that require a saving throw use your Runesmith class DC. If a rune doesn't have a specific tradition trait, you can instead write it in the style of any of the 4 magical traditions, as long as you're trained in that skill. Runes aren't spells. However, things that affect spells also affect runes if they would be bad. So if you can't cast spells, or if something protects against spells, then it will apply to tracing or invoking runes, although you can continue to benefit from a rune's passive effects. And then any rune you use will be the same level you are, and they will have heightened entries the same way that a kineticist does, going by the level. Now, as for the runic repertoire, this is the number of runes you know. This is essentially like a spell repertoire for a spontaneous caster. You start out with 4 runes, and you can choose those from the rune list, which is provided below. And as you level up, you can add more according to the table here. So you start out with 4, and you go all the way to 13. Now, Runesmith also has the Shield Block General feat at level 1, and a class feat at level 1, and every even number afterwards as normal. But with the Shield Block, Runesmith is going to be able to make pretty decent work out of having a shield, and even more so when we get into the rest of the class down below. At 2nd level, you are also going to get Runic Crafter. This gives you the magical crafting skill feat, even if you don't meet the prerequisite of being an expert in crafting, I believe. And you automatically gain the formulas for all of the fundamental runes, armor, shield, and weapon, as soon as your level equals each item's. And you don't need a formula book to record the formula of any runes you learn how to create. You get skill feats and general feats and skill increases as normal, ancestry feats as well, and you have the standard level 5, level 13 weapon proficiency scaling. At level 7, your class DC increases to expert. It says master here, but it's a pretty easy to understand typo here. It is expert runes, so your class DC increases at the same level that spellcasters are getting their spellcasting proficiency. You also gain reflex expertise, so now you have all 3 saves at expert at level 7. Runic Optimization is their kind of unique twist, the Runesmith's unique twist on weapon specialization. You essentially gain the benefits of weapon specialization, but rather than being tied to your proficiency, it's tied to the level of your striking rune, of the weapon that you are wielding. Notably, it's not worded in a way that it would work perfectly well with unarmed attacks, since it says weapons specifically here. I know that the hand wraps are counted as weapons in some circumstances, but this might be worth looking into for as far as playtest feedback goes. At level 9, whenever you roll a check to craft a magic item in downtime and the item is a permanent rune, you get a degree of success better than the result of your crafting check. It's not very impactful for most games, but it can certainly add up if it is relevant. At level 11, you gain Fortitude Mastery. At level 13, you get the standard increase to Expert on your armor proficiencies, as well as Perception Expertise, as well as the aforementioned Mastery in Weapons. At level 15, you get your own version of Greater Weapon Specialization, as well as Master Class DC, again keeping up with Spellcaster DC. And then at level 19, you increase again for your Runesmith class DC to Legendary, keeping up perfectly with Spellcasters the whole way through, and Medium Armor Mastery. Now, you might notice that their saves, as well as Perception, progress pretty poorly here. They start out with 2 experts and a trained, which is pretty standard. They don't get their 3rd expert until level 7, and then they don't get a master until level 11, and then they never get anything better than that. It's not the worst thing in the world. Saves tend to be the type of thing that doesn't affect how a class feels too strongly, but you might want to look out if you're going to be coming under fire from various spell effects or different things that have saves. You might want to buy some alchemical items to supplement your weakest saves. Now, we're going to skip the feats for just a moment so that you can get a better understanding of what the Runesmith is about by looking at their runes. So, as mentioned before, the way these runes work is you can have 2 of them etched permanently onto some items or some people, and then during combat for 1 action in melee or 2 actions at range, you can apply these runes onto their targets until the end of your next turn. And then finally, with a single action, the invoke action, you can take the invocation effect or cause the invocation effect of all runes within 30 feet of you. So, with that in mind, when we look at the runes, what are we faced with? Well, we'll start off with the first one here, Atral Rune of Fire. You can either draw it on a creature or an object. It reduces the bearer's fire resistance, if any, by 6, and bearer is the word for a thing with a rune on it, so whatever you apply Atral to, its fire resistance is reduced by 6, although this does not affect immunities. And then whenever you invoke it, the bearer takes 2d6 fire damage with a basic fortitude save, and on a critical failure, they're dazzled for a round. And then every 2 levels, so level 3, 5, 7, etc., the reduction in fire resistance up top, the passive effect increases by 1, and the damage of the invocation increases by 2d6. It's a pretty good amount of damage. So, with that, now you can kind of conceptualize how this could be used. You could apply it onto, well, maybe not, maybe you wouldn't want to apply it onto anyone during your exploration mode. You wouldn't want to etch it on and walk around taking fireballs worth of damage. But in the middle of combat, you can use a single action to apply it onto an adjacent creature. It doesn't require any sort of check, although it is a manipulate action. And then your next action could be to invoke it and cause them to take some fire damage with lowered fire resistance, if they have any. So then we can progress on to other things. They have a similar rune, Esvidir, Rune of Whetstones. It causes your weapon, it's etched onto a piercing or slashing weapon or unarmed strike. On a successful strike, the weapon deals an additional 2 persistent bleed damage per weapon damage die. So that's 2 to 8 whenever you hit, which is very nice. But then, if you invoke it, it causes 2d6 slashing damage to a creature adjacent to the rune bearer with a basic fortitude save, and that also heightens by 2d6. There is no heightening on the passive effect here. And so if you combine these two, you could etch Atril onto someone else, Esvidir onto your own blade, and then invoke both with your third action and deal 4d6 damage with 2 different fortitude saves, 2d6 each, for your whole turn. Obviously that would require them to be starting next to you, but this is the sort of thing that you can expect out of the class. I don't want to focus too much on the damage. One of my biggest critiques of the class thus far is that the damage is, I think, too big of a draw. There are a lot of really amazing utility effects in the Runesmith, but the fact that the damage is both very high and very easy to access means that a lot of those things I think are going to be overlooked by some players. So let me get into some of the more interesting things to me to show you what I'm talking about. Here we have Holtrick, Rune of Dwarven Ramparts. You draw this on a shield, and it increases the AC of the shield when you raise it. You use the raise a shield action by 1. So if you have, for example, I'll bring up here a fortress shield, one of my favorite items in the game. It's a very slow shield that requires a lot of strength to carry. It's very bulky as well, bulk of 5. You need a strength of at least +2, or else raising it takes 2 actions, but it gives you a +3 AC bonus when you raise the shield. And so if you were to inscribe Holtrick onto it, it will give you a +4 to your armor class when you raise it. And then additionally, you can use the invoke action to raise the shield bearing the rune, and this is even if someone else is holding the shield. You could be 30 feet away with your rune on someone else's shield, and you invoke it, and it causes them to raise the shield, which is a lot of fun. It's kind of something that we haven't seen before. And then the shield retains the increased bonus to AC until the beginning of the creature's next turn, so that +4 there. That's a lot of fun, and you can see how that is a very powerful effect, even though it's maybe not as exciting as dealing a whole bunch of damage. You can raise someone else's shield. You could even, for a single action, ready to raise a shield and kind of be baiting attacks in one direction, and then massively reducing the chances that it does significant damage. There are other effects here that I love, things like the Rune of Coward's Bane that was in the preview. It gives a status bonus to AC against physical ranged attacks just when the shield is raised. This is also drawn on a shield. And then when you invoke it, it creates an illusion in the mind of all adjacent creatures to the rune bearer. It lasts for 1 round, and it creates a wall that blocks all paths away from the rune bearer. So the creatures adjacent to the rune bearer can't willingly move farther away from the rune bearer for a round unless they disbelieve the illusion. That's a lot of fun and very interesting. And then when we get up into the higher level runes, actually before we do that, I'll talk about some diacritics. Diacritics, for example, we have Sun here, the diacritic Rune of Preservation. You draw this onto a rune. So for example, you could trace Holtrick onto a shield, and then you could trace Sun onto Holtrick, and you would get Sun Holtrick. And this rune would then, after the base rune is invoked, the rune automatically traces itself back upon the same target. And so now when you invoke Holtrick to raise their shield and they have that increased bonus to AC, it will trace itself back onto the target, and that whole trick will last until the end of your next turn. So you essentially get to skip out on a whole trace action by having this etched before. It's a lot of fun. And there's some other interesting things here too, like the Rune of Homecoming. Draw it on a creature. They can move towards you faster. And then you can invoke it to teleport them adjacent to you, etc. When we get into the higher level runes here, we can see some more very interesting and even very powerful things. Ikelsu, one of my favorites. You draw it on a creature, and they are affected by the See the Unseen spell and gain all-around vision. So this means they cannot be flanked, which is already a very good effect, but then the See the Unseen allows them to see invisible creatures. That's an incredible amount of value for just a single etch, and being able to place it on any amount of creatures as long as you have the rune slots to etch is very good. And then it can also be invoked to attach eyes to all creatures in a 20-foot emanation from the rune bearer. Each of those creatures that was invisible becomes concealed instead, not even hidden. And each one that was concealed for any other reason is no longer concealed. And that lasts for 2 rounds. That's a lot of fun. My biggest issue here with the runes is, like I mentioned before, I do have an issue with how attractive and powerful the damage is, even though it isn't actually like an absurdly strong damaging option. It has this insane Nova potential. There are 3 runes that can do damage, significant damage here. Atril, Esvidir, and Ranchu. And if you combine all 3 of those, you can do anywhere from 6d6 to 60d6. And that's an immense amount of Nova potential if something critically fails a few times. That's not necessarily going to happen. Most creatures will succeed their saves, which means that the damage that you'll expect is not even very significant. But the fact that it's there and the fact that it's so easy to use, you just run up to someone, trace it onto them, invoke it, and do a bunch of damage, means that I worry that people aren't going to be drawn to these other incredibly powerful, incredibly interesting runes. And then the other thing, which I'm sure will be solved when we get out of the playtest phase, is that there are not very many runes. There are only 2 level 17 runes, for example, Rovan and Aowen. Aowen? Whatever. So, now with the runes kind of explained and put into context, we can talk about a few of the feats, and then I'll do my final thoughts and wrap up. There are some very interesting sort of like action compression features, like engraving strike once a round as an action while wielding a melee weapon. Make a strike, and on a success you also trace a rune onto the target. Or like remote detonation, where once per round as a free action, your next ranged strike, or if your next action is a successful ranged strike, using physical ammunition against a target within the first range increment, which is a whole lot of words there. You also invoke all the runes on the target, even if they are outside of the range of your normal invoke action. And if the strike was a critical success, the target takes a -1 circ on their saving throws against the runes invoked by remote detonation. There's also a very interesting rune singer feat where you can sing runes onto people, very rarely, as well as backup runic enhancement, where you gain the ability to cast sigil, and then either runic body or runic weapon automatically heightened. The runic tattoo feat line is very interesting. You have a rune which is a tattoo on your body. You can invoke it once per day, and then later on there are some feats to improve it. My biggest issue with the runes here, or with the Runesmith's feats here, is actually there's this entire sort of continual feat concept of these invocation feats. So, for example, here we have Vital Composite Invocation. 2 actions, once per 10 minutes. You can invoke 2 runes of your choice on a single creature, but one must be divine and the other must be primal. In addition to the rune's normal effects, the creature also regains hit points equal to your int mod plus double your level. So that's not a ton of healing, and it requires 2 specific, not necessarily a specific rune, but pretty narrow runes to be on the same creature, and for all that and an extra action invoking, and you can only invoke those 2 runes, it's still once per 10 minutes. So if we go back down to the runes here, for example, Atral is primal, Esvidir is just magical, so you can do it with any of the different traditions. Holtrick is also just magical, so is Mersil, but then Olginex is occult, Pluna is just magical, Ranshu is primal, and then if we get into some of these other runes, like Fikris, we have arcane, Ikelsu is occult, Inth is a diacritic and it's divine. I don't want to go over every rune, of course, but the biggest issue I have here is that this entire line of feats, they're not connected. There are no like prerequisites of earlier feats, are spend extra actions to invoke specific runes, and they have to match traditions for an effect, and the effect usually is not particularly outstanding, and then they also have 10-minute cooldowns. For example here, Clashing Composite Invocation. You invoke 2 runes of your choice on a single creature, which must be from opposed traditions of magic, either an arcane and divine, or an occult and primal. In addition to the normal effects, they need to attempt a fortitude saving throw, as the destructive magic causes them to potentially become sickened, or even sickened too. And the biggest issue here is that you are already a class that is worrying about martial tactics and these very complicated runes. You're almost a spellcaster with a very limited repertoire, and you have to now also worry about which of the 4 traditions each of your runes is, so that you can spend more actions on a timer to get generally not outstanding additional effects. Like I'm not going to pretend that int mod plus double your level in regained hit points isn't a nice benefit, or that the ability to make something sickened 1 isn't a nice benefit, but when it's essentially costing at least an extra action, but then also all of this headspace that you have to dedicate to kind of keeping track of what you've put on what, it's a lot of effort for not enough back. I love the idea, but I do not think that these feats work. I think that they either need to be dropped in action cost, they need to lose their frequency, or they need to be stronger, or the entire idea of having the runes as the 4 traditions of magic, as cool as it is, as much as I love the lore implications and concept of it, I just don't think it works very well in a class that is already doing so many other things. If you're going to have it be these sorts of dedicated things, because now it's like I pick up this invocation, and of course I'm going to be able to settle into like learning my runes and what combos I can pull off, but it's ultimately not rewarding enough, I think, is what I'm trying to nail on here. And I'm not sure if it would be better to drop the concept entirely or just make these more rewarding so that they can be these more interesting sort of concepts as well. Because the other big thing, of course, with being 2 actions, considering the action economy of the Runesmith, is that this is always going to be a 2-turn activity where you're spending 4 actions. Outside of some circumstances where maybe you have some runes etched, and for example, like the Vital Composite, you have a Divine and a Primal rune on someone, and then you can invoke both to also heal them. But like the offensive ones, you're going to have to be invoking after spending an action tracing and another action tracing. And you can do that on 1 turn or across 2 turns, but on that second turn, you'll have to spend those 2 actions to invoke, and I just don't think that that's working quite as well as it could. Anyways, I do think that the class overall is very interesting. I think it's a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to when we get more options for it, and when we get some cleanup on the rougher edges of it. My overall thoughts and like overall summary, Runesmith is a sort of squishier and martial, but you have a lot of the utility and more like focused utility of being a spellcaster, and a lot of potency in that you can take advantage of and respond to situations in a way that a spellcaster might be able to. Something goes invisible, you etch the See Invisible Things rune onto your friends and invoke it, and then everything becomes visible for everyone for a little bit. You can lock down creatures with walls, you can do damage, you can teleport, etc. There's a lot of fun things here, but I think there are some very rough spots as well. I don't think people are going to have to worry too much about the low survivability of the Runesmith. Saving throws, as I mentioned, are not the biggest deal, and so even having poor saving throws like the Runesmith does and poor perception, I think they're going to be able to get plenty out of a combat, particularly with all the tools. As I mentioned, the hand situation is kind of odd because needing either a free hand or a held artisan's toolkit, and then having many feats that are built around a shield means that I think a lot of runesmiths are going to end up using a shield with a shield boss or shield spikes on it, and an open hand for their character, because a lot of the other options just aren't particularly appealing given what that has to offer you. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing this class go forward through the playtest, seeing how it turns out in the end, because I think it has a lot of awesome stuff. That's going to be it from me today. Leave a like if you liked the video, subscribe if you would like to see more, and toss me a few bucks on coffee if you would like to keep the channel running. See ya. See ya. Thank you to my coffee supporters. Shout out to Nether Bovine for the one-off donation. And thank you to Kizo, Sakdi, and Phoenix FH for their monthly continued support at the few bucks support tier. You're what keeps this channel running, and I can't express how much I appreciate it. Have a good one. Thank you.